The wind swept across the open plains, carrying the sharp scent of sagebrush and the faint copper tang of old iron. Sunlight struggled to pierce the low-hanging clouds, casting the ranch in a shadowy gray that made the familiar hills look foreign, almost threatening. He paused at the edge of the corral, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and squinted toward the horizon. Something felt off, though he couldn't put his finger on it. He had walked these grounds for years, every ridge and ditch etched into memory, but today it seemed like the land itself was holding its breath. He turned back toward the farmhouse, the wood creaking under the weight of silence, and that's when he saw her. Standing in the doorway, coat pulled tight against the gusting wind. She looked smaller than usual against the battered frame of the old house. Her eyes met his, sharp and urgent, and a shiver ran down his spine. "Get inside first," she warned, voice low but unwavering. The words struck him harder than a bullet. He froze, heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't the warning itself that unsettled him. It was the conviction behind it. She didn't speak lightly, and every time she did, he knew trouble wasn't far behind. The kind of trouble that could change a man's life forever. He wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to shake off the unease. But something in the way she pressed her hands against the doorframe, like bracing for impact, made him hesitate. The ranch, his home, the place that had been a refuge for decades, suddenly felt fragile, as if it were balanced on the edge of some unseen danger. He glanced over his shoulder at the fields, stretching toward the distant tree line. Dust swirled in odd patterns along the fence posts, a warning that the wind wasn't the only thing moving tonight. Shadows shifted where they shouldn't, bending the shapes of familiar buildings into distorted versions of themselves. He had lived through harsh winters, lightning storms, even the odd brush with wandering cattle rustlers, but nothing had ever made him feel the kind of primal unease that had settled over him now. He could sense it deep in his bones, the feeling that the calm before a storm was never truly calm. The sun dipped lower, the sky turning a dull, bruised purple. He finally moved, boots heavy against the worn planks of the porch. Each step toward the door felt like crossing some invisible line. She held the door open, and for a brief moment, he caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. Not the kind born of a passing worry, but the sort that anchors itself in memory, one that warns a person to never forget. She stepped aside, gesturing him inside, and the faint smell of kerosene lamps and aged wood filled his senses. Inside, the shadows seemed to gather in corners, reaching quietly toward the flickering light. He shut the door behind him, the latch clicking into place with an almost too loud finality. The sudden silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by the distant howl of the wind across the plains. He turned to face her, searching for some explanation, but she just shook her head. Her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes scanning the room, then darting toward the windows as though the storm outside had found a way in. "You don't want to see it yet," she said, voice tight. The air in the house felt heavy, laden with a tension he couldn't name. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old beams above seemed amplified. He had walked through many storms, faced challenges that would have made lesser men turn away. Yet the fear that gripped him now was unlike anything before. It wasn't just about the ranch, or even their safety. It was about the unknown. It's that thin line between what a man could control and what would control him if he wasn't careful. He glanced at the fireplace, where the last embers of a dying fire cast flickering shadows across the room. The shadows danced like old spirits, twisting familiar shapes into something menacing. Outside, the wind carried a faint sound, almost like voices or whispers traveling across the plains. He strained to hear, but the moment passed as quickly as it came. He realized then that the danger was not something he could outrun or fight with brute strength. This was a test of patience, of instinct, of the kind of courage that comes only when a man faces a choice he cannot ignore. She moved closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried more weight than words. "Tonight changes everything," she murmured, "and you need to be ready." He wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but the look in her eyes silenced him. There was no room for disbelief, no time for hesitation. Whatever was coming, it would arrive, whether he was ready or not. The ranch outside was quiet now, eerily so. Even the animals had sensed the shift, and their usual low murmurings were replaced by a tense stillness. He thought about the barns, the fences, the endless stretches of land that had been his life for as long as he could remember. Every familiar sight now carried a hint of uncertainty. What had once been a place of comfort had become a stage for the unknown, and he was standing at the center of it. He thought back to that moment in the doorway, her warning echoing in his mind. Get inside first. There was something about the phrasing that lingered, something more than simple caution. It was almost like a command from fate itself, a signal that whatever happened next would not just test him, but change him forever. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ranch was no longer just land and livestock. It had become a crucible, a place where lives were measured and destinies decided. As the last light of day faded behind the hills, he found himself staring out the window, waiting. The wind had settled into an unnatural quiet, and even the distant ridge seemed still, almost holding its breath. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of tension that makes a man's skin prickle. And then he saw a shadow moving along the tree line, slow, deliberate, and impossibly silent. His stomach tightened, and he felt the old pulse of adrenaline coursing through him, the same that had carried him through countless dangers before. But this was different. She stood beside him, hands still on his shoulder, eyes fixed on the same spot. Neither of them spoke. Words would have been pointless. The shadow was out there, waiting, and whatever it represented was about to come closer. The ranch that had always been a sanctuary now felt exposed, vulnerable, as if it were holding its breath for something beyond comprehension. And in that suspended moment, he understood that the night ahead would decide more than the safety of their home. It would decide who he was, who they were, and what life would look like when the storm finally broke. The weight of possibility pressed down on him, heavy and unyielding. One step outside, one wrong move, and everything could change. He took a deep breath, hand gripping the edge of the window frame, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath his fingers. He wanted to move, to run, to do something that would restore a sense of control. But the words lingered, clear as the fading wind outside. Get inside first. And as the shadow edged closer, moving with a patience that unnerved him, he realized that tonight, everything he had believed about his life, the land, and even himself, might be overturned in an instant. The rancher's heart raced, every muscle taut with anticipation. Whatever was coming, there was no turning back now. The threshold had been crossed, and the storm, literal or not, was ready to claim its due. He glanced at her one last time, eyes searching for reassurance, for a hint of what to do next. But her face was calm, resolute, the kind of calm born from facing danger head-on, the kind that demands courage in the face of fear. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her warning settle in his chest like a stone. Tonight would change everything. And as the first rustle of movement reached the porch, he knew he was about to find out just how true that was. The wind rose again, a cold, insistent push that rattled the window panes. Outside, the shadow stopped, just beyond the circle of dim light spilling from the doorway. And for the first time he understood that the life he had always known, the quiet rhythm of work, the familiar landscape, the simple certainties of a rancher's existence was gone. All that remained was the unknown, and the choice of whether he would face it or be swept away. Get inside first. She had said it, and now there was no time left. The wind clawed at the edges of the porch, rattling the boards beneath his feet like dry bones. He stayed pressed against the doorframe, every sense alert, listening for the faintest hint of movement outside. The shadow beyond the light didn't shift, yet he could feel its presence, heavy and patient, as if it knew exactly how long to wait. Inside, the house seemed smaller, tighter, and every familiar sound, the crackle of the dying fire, the creak of the ceiling beams, suddenly took on a menacing quality. She moved away from him, crouching slightly to peer through the cracks of the window without drawing attention. Her face was pale under the dim glow of the lamp, eyes narrowed, scanning every inch of the darkened yard. "It's not just a stranger," she whispered, voice almost drowned by the wind. Something's been following this land for a long time. Longer than we've even been here. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had known the place for decades, walked these fields in every season. Yet the idea of a lurking presence that predated his ownership made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He stepped away from the door, forcing himself to move, but each step toward the hearth felt like treading through invisible mud. He thought about the history of the ranch. Stories his father had told him of the first settlers of cattle drives, and long winters, when men and women had fought not just nature, but whatever else roamed these lands. Ghost stories, he had always thought, tales to pass the long evenings. But now, facing that shadow just outside the circle of light, those stories seemed more like warnings, written into the land itself. "Do you think it's someone from town?" he asked cautiously, voice low. "A rustler? A thief?" She shook her head, turning back toward the window. "No, this is older, smarter, not a man. Not yet." Her words left him staring at the flickering shadows along the walls. The firelight playing tricks on his mind, making ordinary shapes feel alive and watching. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic. Something that didn't belong on the prairie. He wrinkled his nose, heart hammering, and thought about the barn, the grain shed, and the old stables. Every structure had been built with care, each beam set to withstand storms and the weight of years. But no amount of timber or iron could defend against the unknown. He had learned that the hard way. During years when the land had thrown everything at him, blizzards, wildfires, stampedes, but this was different. This was intentional, patient, and quietly powerful. She stepped away from the window, finally turning to face him fully. Her hand brushed against his arm again, a grounding gesture, yet it did little to calm the tension clawing at his chest. "We didn't know it at first," she said softly, "but this land carries a history that won't let go. There have been warnings before disappearances, strange happenings, but they were always dismissed as accidents. We thought the ranch was ours alone, but we were wrong." He swallowed hard, trying to imagine what she meant. Disappearances? Strange happenings? The thought of neighbors, hands he had shaken, people whose lives had vanished like smoke, gnawed at him. He realized how little he truly knew about the land he had spent his life tending. The ranch wasn't just soil and cattle. It was layered with stories. Some whispered, some forgotten, and now it seemed. Some were coming back to demand attention outside. The shadow shifted slightly, just enough to remind him it hadn't gone anywhere. He could hear the faintest scrape of movement against the earth. His hands instinctively went to the tools he kept nearby, not for work, but for protection. But he knew there was no tool, no weapon, that could prepare him for what might be coming. Fear settled in, thick and cold. Wrapping around his chest, she moved to the fireplace and added a log. The sudden burst of warmth and light doing little to push back the darkness pressing against the windows. "When my father came here," she continued, voice tight, he noticed it first. Things disappearing. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, animals acting strange. He tried to leave once. Never made it past the ridge road. Came back days later, changed. Quiet. Different. He said he didn't want anyone else to know. He wanted to protect the land. And us. He listened, mind racing. Her father had been a cautious man, measured, respected by everyone in town. If he had been frightened, it meant whatever haunted the ranch was real, and it was patient. His thoughts flicked back to the shadow lingering just beyond the doorway, a silent predator that had no need for haste. The thought of the land hiding secrets for generations, waiting for someone to uncover them, made the ranch feel ancient, alive, almost sentient. "Do you think it's bound to the land?" he asked, voice barely audible. She nodded. "Some of it, maybe. Some of it, I don't know. It chooses its moments, its targets. But it's been patient, waiting for the right time." She glanced at him, eyes flicking briefly to the doorway. "Tonight, it's here, and we can't ignore it." A sudden crash came from outside, startling both of them. The firelight trembled, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. He leaped toward the window, heart racing, but saw nothing clearly. Only the trees at the edge of the property swaying violently in a gust, and the shadow, darker than night itself, lingering just beyond the fence. He realized that this wasn't about theft or even confrontation. This was about something older, something testing them, testing the very limits of their courage. He stepped back from the window, mind swirling with questions. How had he missed it all these years? How had the ranch, which had always felt so solid and reliable, become a place of such mystery? Every rustle of wind now seemed like a whisper from the past, every creak a footstep from something unseen. He wondered if the stories he had dismissed as old-timers' tales were actually warnings, coded in the language of the land. She moved closer again, hand brushing his arm lightly. "You need to know the history," she said. "Before tonight I never told anyone. But now, you need to understand. This ranch, it's been a place where things happen, things that can't be explained. And every generation leaves a mark whether they realize it or not." He followed her toward the old study, where books and papers were stacked in piles like small fortresses. Dust coated the surfaces, undisturbed for months. Yet the air felt charged, as if those stories had been waiting for him to arrive. She pulled a folder from the shelf, the edges frayed, yellowed with age, and opened it on the table. Inside were photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings, tales of missing people. Strange lights over the plains, animals found acting erratically, even reports of voices calling in the night. He picked up a clipping carefully, tracing the lines with a finger. The date was decades old, the location unmistakably their ranch. The headline read, "Ranchers mystified by disappearances in the plains." He swallowed hard, realizing this was not a new phenomenon. This land had been quietly shaping the lives of those who lived here long before him. And now it seemed it had chosen him as part of that story. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, carrying with it a low, mournful howl that sounded almost like voices. The shadow had moved closer, closer still, to the edge of the porch light. He felt a cold sweat on his neck. Every instinct screamed to run, to barricade, but the weight of generations pressed down on him. The land was no longer just property. It was a test, a place where courage, patience, and understanding were measured against the unknown. She leaned toward him, voice urgent but calm. "Whatever is out there, it doesn't rush. It waits. And tonight, it has chosen to reveal itself in a way that will change everything we thought we knew. You have to be ready not just to face it, but to understand it." He nodded, heart still racing, eyes drawn again to the doorway where the shadow lingered. Outside, the prairie seemed to hold its breath, waiting with him. Every creak of the boards, every whisper of the wind, every flicker of firelight on the walls reminded him that the night had only begun. The ranch, steeped in history, mystery, and unspoken warnings, was alive with secrets that demanded to be acknowledged. And as the shadow edged closer to the porch, patient, deliberate, and silent, he knew that whatever happened next would not just test him, it would change him. Every moment stretching between the familiar warmth of the house and the unknown darkness beyond the light was charged with a tension that could not be ignored. He took a deep breath, feeling the rough grain of the table beneath his fingers. This was no ordinary night. The ranch was no longer simply a home. It was a threshold, a place where past and present collided. And the choices he made in the coming hours would echo far beyond the boundaries of land and life he had always known. Outside, the wind whispered again, carrying the faintest hint of movement, and the shadow waited, patient, silent, watching, and in that moment, he understood that nothing in his life had prepared him for what was about to unfold. The wind had softened, but the night seemed heavier than before, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on the ranch. Outside, the shadow had not moved closer, yet its presence was undeniable. He could feel it in the quiet scrape of the boards underfoot, in the subtle shift of the air that carried a chill straight through his jacket. Every instinct screamed caution, but he knew he couldn't leave the farmhouse. Not while the unknown waited beyond the door, patient, silent, and deliberate. She was standing near the window again, eyes tracing the fence line where the shadow had been, trying to catch any movement, "It's testing us," she said quietly, almost to herself. He glanced at her, noticing for the first time how tense her jaw was, how her hands gripped the windowsill. "Testing? How?" he asked. She turned slowly, eyes dark and unreadable. "Everything has a pattern. The wind, the animals, the shadows. It watches how we respond, how we move, how we react, and then it decides what to do next." He swallowed hard, thinking about the cattle grazing in the distant fields. Normally, their low murmurs and occasional snorts were comforting, grounding him in the familiar rhythm of ranch life. But tonight the animals were silent. He had walked past the pastures earlier in the day, checking fences and water troughs, but tonight the emptiness felt like a warning. Something had changed in the balance of this place. The land that had always been his sanctuary now felt like a stage, and he and the people he cared about were unwilling actors under an unseen gaze. "I don't know if I can face this," he admitted, voice low. The words felt strange leaving his mouth. He was a man who had endured droughts, stampedes, even the occasional threat from outsiders. But this was different. The uncertainty, the slow, deliberate approach of whatever waited outside was suffocating. She stepped closer, hand brushing his arm, grounding him again. "You don't have to face it alone," she said, "but you do have to face it. That's the only way this ends, or at least, the only way we survive tonight." He nodded, though the weight in his chest did not lighten. He felt the pull of generations of men and women who had walked this land, each leaving traces of their courage, their fear, their failures. The ranch was more than wood and soil. It was memory, warning, and history layered together like the rings of a tree. And now, something was forcing its way into that history, demanding recognition. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. And he noticed a corner of the room that always seemed ordinary now looked different. The shapes of the furniture, the outlines of old bookshelves. Even the small cracks in the plaster appeared sharper, almost predatory. He realized that every inch of this house, every familiar object, could be hiding secrets. He had thought he knew every corner of this place, yet the fear gnawing at him suggested otherwise. She moved toward the table, rifling through the folder of old papers and photographs again. "Look at this," she said, placing a photograph in front of him. It was an image of the ranch taken decades ago, the sun low in the sky casting long shadows. But there was something in the photograph that made him pause, a dark blur near the tree line, just like the shadow outside. He leaned closer, heart pounding, realizing that what they were facing was not a new threat. It had been here long before either of them. He traced the blur with a finger, mind racing. How could it have stayed hidden all these years? He asked. "It's impossible." She shook her head. "It's not impossible. It's patient. It waits until it's ready, until it knows it can make itself seen. That's why my father never spoke of it openly. Some things, he believed, are better left unchallenged until the right moment." The sound of hoofbeats reached them from somewhere in the distance, faint and irregular. He froze, heart leaping. The cattle? No. The pattern was wrong. Something larger, heavier, moving with intent. He pressed his hand to the table, trying to steady himself, and she put a hand on his shoulder again, firm but gentle. "This is more than a night," she said. "It's a turning point. And the choices we make now will echo for a long time. If we hesitate, we might lose more than just this night." He turned toward the window again, straining to see past the dim light, past the veil of night that hid the shadow. It had shifted slightly, edges blurred, but its presence remained undeniable. Fear and curiosity battled inside him. He wanted to step outside, to confront it head-on, but instinct told him to wait. This was not a challenge that could be met with courage alone. It required observation, understanding, patience. She moved away from the window, returning to the fire. Her movements were deliberate, measured, as if she too was aware that any misstep could trigger something dangerous. "There are stories," she began, almost as if speaking to herself, of people who tried to fight what they didn't understand. They didn't survive. Not because it was cruel, but because they didn't respect it. It has rules. We just have to find them. He studied her face, noting the tension etched into her features. She had grown up on this land, learned its rhythms and whispers, but tonight even she seemed unsettled. That made him realize how serious this was. If she was unsure, he had every reason to be wary. The ranch, their home, had become a place of riddles and unseen power, and the night had only just begun. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows again, carrying with it the faint metallic scent he had noticed earlier. He inhaled sharply, trying to pinpoint its source. It was coming from the barn, from the other side of the yard. He looked at her. "Do we need to check it?" he asked. Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Not yet," she said. "It's testing our patience. If we move too soon, we give it the advantage. We wait, we watch. That's all we can do until we understand what it wants." He sank into a chair near the fire, rubbing his hands together, trying to shake off the chill creeping up his arms. The photographs and letters on the table whispered of past encounters, of generations who had faced similar moments with varying degrees of success. He realized that every story ended differently, but the constant was the land itself, the witness, the keeper of history, the silent judge. Outside, the shadow had shifted again, no closer, but more defined. Its form seemed to ripple, changing subtly, as if aware of their gaze. He felt a shiver run down his spine. This was not a person, nor an animal. It was something else, something older, waiting for them to respond, to reveal themselves through fear, hesitation, or courage. She leaned forward, hands resting lightly on the table. "We need to understand the patterns," she said. "The wind, the animals, the way shadows move, all of it matters. Everything that happens is connected. We can't afford to ignore even the smallest detail." He nodded, eyes drawn again to the photograph on the table. The shadow in that image was blurry, but unmistakable. It had been here decades ago, and now it had returned. He thought about the cattle in the pastures, the barns, the fences. Everything that had once been routine was now part of a larger puzzle. He realized the ranch had always been alive in ways he hadn't noticed its history, its cycles, its warnings, and now the present was colliding with the past in a way that demanded attention. A low creak echoed from above. From the attic, perhaps, or the rafters, a sound that made him jump. She put a hand on his arm, grounding him. "It's trying to communicate," she said, "or at least make itself known. It's patient, but it's deliberate. Every sound, every movement, every flicker of light, it's all part of its message." He leaned back, heart racing, and tried to make sense of it all. The shadow outside, the history on the ranch, the stories his father had told him, the strange scent on the wind, they were pieces of a larger picture. A puzzle he didn't yet know how to solve. Every instinct told him that this was bigger than a single night, bigger than any danger he had faced before. The firelight flickered, casting new shapes across the walls. Shadows stretched and twisted, merging with the darkness that seeped in through the windows. He felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, reminding him that courage alone might not be enough. Understanding, observation, patience, these were the tools he would need to survive what was coming. Outside, the shadow shifted once more, just at the edge of the porch light. Its presence was undeniable, patient and observant. The ranch had become a crucible, a place where every choice mattered, and every hesitation carried consequence. He knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that tonight would test not just his courage, but his understanding of the land, the history, and the mysteries that had been waiting for him all along. And in that heavy, quiet moment, he realized that the night had only begun, and the ranch would not let them rest until the first choice had been made, and the first step toward the unknown had been taken. The night pressed in closer, thick and suffocating, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic that lingered just beyond the porch light. The shadow had not moved closer, yet its presence was a living thing. Patient, deliberate, waiting for them to make the first move. He felt the weight of every moment, every creak in the house, every whisper of wind, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Anticipating what would come next, she stood near the window, eyes dark, scanning the darkness beyond the yard. "It's testing us," she said again, voice low, almost a chant against the night. "Every step we take, every breath we draw, it watches, and it learns." He swallowed hard, realizing how vulnerable they were. All his years on this land, all his experience, all his strength, it meant nothing against the unknown that waited silently. He wanted to move, to check the barn, the pastures, the fences, but he knew better. This wasn't about rushing or brute force. This was about patience, about reading the land, about understanding the rhythm of the shadow that had come back to the ranch. A sudden howl of wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, an animal cried out, piercing the night like a warning. He flinched, gripping the edge of the table as his pulse hammered in his ears. She moved closer, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "It's more than wind," she whispered. "Listen. Every sound is a part of it." He strained to hear the shifting of branches, the faint rustle across the porch, the low, almost imperceptible scraping sound coming from the barn. The ranch had always been alive with noise, but tonight every sound felt like a message. Every shadow seemed deliberate, as though the darkness itself was watching, waiting for a misstep. The lamp flickered, throwing long, erratic shadows across the walls. He thought about the history she had told him, the stories of her father, previous generations who had walked these lands and encountered something older than any man. Those tales, once dismissed as warnings or superstition, now carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The shadow beyond the light wasn't just a thing of the night, it was a continuation of the past, a force that had waited decades for this moment. A sudden crash sounded from the barn, sharp and heavy. He jumped, heart racing, and instinctively moved toward the door. She put a hand on his chest, halting him. "Wait," she said. "Don't give it what it wants. Patience. Observation. That's all we have until we know more." He forced himself back toward the fireplace, trying to calm his racing thoughts, though every muscle in his body remained tense. Ready to spring into action? He remembered the photograph again, the shadow captured decades ago, standing just beyond the tree line. That image had been taken long before either of them had been born, yet now it had returned, tangible and patient. Every story, every warning, every clue from the past was converging into this single moment. The ranch, once a place of routine and safety, had become a stage for the unknown, and they were at the center of it. Outside, the shadow moved again, subtle, deliberate, like a ripple across still water. He pressed his forehead to the window pane, trying to focus, trying to understand. It was not a person, not an animal, yet it had form, presence, intent. It had been here before, it would survive after, and they were caught in the middle. Fear twisted inside him. But beneath it was a strange clarity, the awareness that every decision they made in the next minutes would matter more than anything before. She turned from the window, eyes fixed on him. "We need to prepare," she said, her voice steady. "Not with weapons, not with brute force. With understanding. Watch the wind, watch the shadows, listen to the land. It communicates if you know how to hear it." He nodded, swallowing hard, and tried to focus. He had always relied on his instincts, on experience. But tonight, instincts alone were not enough. He needed patience, observation, and courage measured by something beyond fear. Another sound came from the barn closer this time. It wasn't loud, but deliberate. Something shifted among the tools and hay inside, a scrape that made his stomach twist. He glanced at her. "It's moving," he said quietly. She nodded. "Yes, but it's still testing. We don't react yet. We wait." His body tensed. Every fiber screamed to confront the unknown, to step outside and face it directly, but he knew she was right. One wrong step, one rash movement, and they would lose the advantage. He thought about the generations before them, the people whose stories filled the old folders and photographs. They had faced this too, in different forms, and some had not survived. The land held memory, and the shadow was part of it, part of the history that refused to remain buried. He felt the weight of that history pressing on his shoulders. Courage alone wouldn't be enough tonight. Understanding, awareness, and timing mattered more. Outside, the shadow shifted again. This time it moved closer to the porch, subtle, deliberate, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there. He pressed his hands to the window, feeling the chill of the night seeping into his skin. It was testing them, teasing them, waiting to see if they would falter. He realized that the ranch had never truly been theirs. It was merely entrusted to them, watched by forces older than anyone he had ever known. And now those forces were awake, and he could not turn away. She walked past him, moving toward the back of the house. "We need to check the perimeter," she said softly. "Not to confront, but to understand. Every shadow, every sound, every step tells a story." He nodded, though the fear twisting in his chest made him hesitate. The thought of stepping into the open, of facing the unknown outside, made his pulse spike. But he also understood that action was inevitable. Patience only went so far. Eventually, they would have to meet whatever waited beyond the light. He followed her, boots quiet against the floorboards, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the shadow near the porch. Every step felt like crossing into the unknown, every creak of the house amplified in the stillness. They moved together, careful, deliberate, feeling the rhythm of the ranch in a way they never had before. The land seemed alive tonight, every tree, every fence post, every patch of grass whispering secrets and warnings. At the back door, she paused and gestured for him to stay behind. "Watch," she whispered. "Learn, don't act yet." Crouched low, peering out into the yard. The shadow was moving again, slow, deliberate, probing the edges of the light. He realized it wasn't random. Every movement had purpose, every pause calculated. This was a force with intelligence, patient, aware, testing them as they had been tested for generations before. A distant howl split the night. Closer now, and the cattle stirred, low murmurs rising in tension. The shadow paused, almost acknowledging the sound, then continued its slow, deliberate approach. He could feel his chest tighten, each heartbeat echoing like a drum in the silence. The ranch had transformed from a place of safety to a stage for the unknown, and he understood that nothing about this night would be ordinary. She returned to his side, eyes scanning the darkness. "It's deliberate," she said quietly. "Every move, every sound, it's telling us something. If we listen, we might survive. If we hesitate too long, we could lose everything." He nodded, gripping the doorframe, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He realized with a cold certainty that tonight would test them more than any storm, any wildfire, or any threat from men could ever do. This was not a fight of strength, but of patience, awareness, and courage measured in moments. The shadow reached the edge of the porch light, slow, deliberate, silent. He held his breath, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on him. Feeling the history of the land, the stories of the people who had walked this ranch before, and realizing that the night was about to change everything. The ranch was no longer just land and buildings. It was alive, watching, testing. And the shadow was the first true messenger of its intent. The wind rose again, carrying the metallic scent he had noticed earlier. It brushed against the back of his neck, and he shivered. Every instinct screamed to move, to confront, to act. But he remembered her words, her steady hand, her insistence on patience. Observation first. Understanding before action. He forced himself to stay still, heart pounding, eyes locked on the shadow. Then, for the first time, he realized it was more than just testing. It was learning, watching their reactions, measuring their fear, gauging their patience. It was patient, deliberate, almost intelligent. And he understood that the next moment, whenever it came, would demand every ounce of his courage and awareness. She leaned close, whispering, "It's ready." "And so must we be." He swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the porch, feeling the chill of the night and the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The shadow lingered, deliberate, patient, waiting for the perfect moment, and he knew that whatever happened next would not just test them. It would change the ranch and their lives forever. The wind rose again, howling across the plains, carrying with it the promise of the unknown. Outside, the shadows shifted, slow, deliberate, and silent, inching closer to the circle of light. The night had reached its tipping point, the tension unbearable, every sound, every shadow, every movement amplified in the stillness. He could feel it in his bones. The climax of this night was coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. The shadow lingered at the edge of the porch light, silent and patient, and he felt the weight of the night pressing in from every side. For what seemed like an eternity, they watched each other, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken understanding. Then, slowly, deliberately, the shadow shifted closer, revealing form in the dim light. It was not a man, nor a beast exactly, but something in between, a shape that seemed to ripple with the memory of the land itself. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glimmered faintly, reflecting the firelight and the resolve in their own. He realized then that the stories, the warnings, the photographs and letters were not exaggerations. They had faced this before, in fragments and whispers, and the land had preserved those encounters as lessons for the generations that followed. Tonight, they were the ones being tested, and the shadow was both judge and guide. It was patient, yes, but also deliberate, waiting for them to acknowledge it, to see it for what it truly was. She moved beside him, hand resting lightly on his arm, grounding him. "It's not here to harm us," she whispered, voice calm but firm. "Not unless we provoke it. It's here to be understood." He swallowed hard, feeling his pulse slowly steady, though the tension in every muscle of his body remained taut. He had spent a lifetime facing storms, rustlers, and the harshness of the land, but this was unlike anything before. Courage alone would not have been enough. Tonight demanded understanding, awareness, and respect for a presence that had always existed on the ranch. The shadow hovered at the porch's edge, then slowly receded, moving back toward the tree line. Its motion was deliberate, almost communicative, as if signaling that their acknowledgement had been enough. The wind softened, the metallic scent dissipating, and the ranch seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had gripped it for hours. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding, feeling the familiar weight of the land settle around him again, though now with a new sense of connection, of awareness, of shared history. She turned to him, eyes bright in the dim light. "It's gone. For now," she said, "but it won't be the last time. The land remembers, and it watches. We have to respect it, or we'll learn the hard way." He nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and reverence. The ranch was no longer just a home. It was a living memory, a place shaped by generations, by secrets, by presences older than anyone could name. And tonight, they had stepped into that history and survived it, not through force, but through understanding. He glanced outside one last time, seeing the faint outline of the shadow retreat into the darkness, melding with the tree line. It was no longer threatening, no longer a force of immediate fear, but it carried the weight of the lessons it had brought. He realized that this encounter had changed him. It had tested his courage, his patience, and his awareness of the land he had always thought he knew. And through it, he had gained a deeper understanding of the ranch, of the land, and of the histories carried within it. The fire flickered, and he turned back to her. "We survived," he said quietly, though the words felt inadequate. She nodded. "Yes, but survival isn't the lesson. Understanding is. We've been given a chance to see the land as it truly is, to acknowledge its memory and respect it. That's what will keep us safe in the future." He felt the truth in her words. The land had always been more than earth and timber. It had been a witness, a keeper of stories, a silent guide for those willing to listen. He moved through the house, checking the doors and windows, each sound grounding him in the familiar rhythm of the ranch. The animals had begun to stir again, low murmurs and occasional snorts breaking the night's tense silence. The cattle, too, seemed to acknowledge the passing of the shadow, turning to their familiar routines, though with a subtle alertness that mirrored their own. The ranch had survived the night, yes, but it had survived through respect, through patience, and through the acknowledgement of a presence that had been part of its history long before either of them had been born, she walked beside him, quietly gathering the old photographs and letters, placing them carefully back in the folder. "We should preserve these," she said. "They're not just history, they're instructions, warnings, lessons. They tell us how to live here, how to respect the land, and how to understand what it carries." He nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. The shadow, the night, the tension, it had all been a test, but also a lesson. A reminder that the ranch was alive, patient, and enduring, and that every generation would have its own trials and encounters. He paused at the porch one last time, looking out over the rolling hills, the pastures, and the distant tree line. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to touch the horizon, casting the ranch in soft golden light. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a reminder of the night and the lessons learned. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a sense of connection not just to the land, but to the generations that had come before, to the stories preserved in photographs, letters, and memory. She stood beside him, silent for a moment, then spoke. "The ranch will always test us. That's its way. But tonight, we listened, we learned, and we respected it. That's what matters. That's what keeps us here." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. This night had been about more than fear. It had been about understanding, about stepping into the unknown and seeing it clearly without panic or force. The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the scent of earth and grass instead of metallic tension. The land seemed to breathe with them, exhaling the long night's suspense and returning to its quiet rhythm. The ranch was alive, yes, but it was not malevolent. It was a keeper of history, a preserver of memory, a guide for those willing to see beyond the immediate, beyond fear. And in that quiet dawn, he understood that the ranch had always been a teacher, not just a home. He turned to her, a small smile breaking through the tension that had gripped him for hours. "We made it," he said. She nodded, returning the smile, though her eyes still held the reverence and caution of someone who knew the land well. "Yes," she said, "but we've learned more than that. We've learned how to listen, how to respect, and how to understand what has always been here. That's what will guide us through the nights to come." He stepped inside, letting the warmth of the house and the flickering fire wash over him. The photographs and letters now seemed less like warnings and more like guides, tools for understanding the rhythms of the land and the shadows it carried. The ranch, the animals, the wind, the shadows, they were all connected. And for the first time, he felt a true awareness of that connection. He understood that fear alone had no power. Understanding, respect, and attention to the subtleties of the land were what allowed life to continue, and allowed him to protect the home that had always been his. Outside, the sun rose higher, painting the fields in gold and shadow, casting the tree line in a glow that softened the night's terror. The shadow had vanished, but the lessons it left behind remained. He knew that this encounter would shape every day to come, informing the way he walked the ranch, cared for the land, and faced the quiet, patient mysteries that it held. The night had tested them, yes, but it had also taught them, leaving them stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. She moved toward the barn, opening the door to check on the animals, and he followed, walking through the yard with a calm that had been absent only hours before. Everything was as it should be, yet different, heightened, alert, aware. The land had survived, the shadow had departed, and the ranchers had learned the rhythm of patience and respect. The old stories, the warnings, the photographs, they were no longer just history. They were guidance, a framework for life on this ranch, in this place that had always been more than it seemed. As he worked alongside her, checking the fences, the water troughs, and the animals, he felt a profound sense of connection. He thought about the generations before him, about the stories that had been passed down quietly, and about the lessons embedded in the land itself. The ranch had tested them, but it had also guided them. The fear had been real, the tension high. But the resolution came not through force or confrontation, it came through understanding, patience, and respect. for what had always been present. By midday, the sun fully illuminated the ranch, revealing the rolling fields, the barns, and the tree line where the shadow had lingered. Everything seemed more alive than before, vibrant and aware. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight, realizing that life on this ranch would never be the same. They had faced something ancient, something patient, and survived not by brute strength, but by listening, watching, and understanding. The ranch, with its history, its memories, and its quiet lessons, had shared its knowledge, and he finally had truly heard it. The ranch remained, as it always had, a place of work, of life, history, but now also a place of memory and awareness, a teacher in its own right. The shadow had departed, leaving behind not fear, but wisdom. And as he and she walked the fields together, tending the land with careful attention and newfound respect, he realized that the true legacy of this night was not the shadow itself, but the understanding it had brought, that courage, patience, and respect for the unknown were the keys to life. And to living fully in a world where history and mystery walked hand in hand, the ranch would always test them again. But now they were ready.